many common traits together, we need not be too surprised to find Abraham being repeatedly put in the same situations as Adam was, as Noah, Enoch, and others, and actually being identified with them in 100 monuments of apocryphal literature. Even now, to be exalted means, for the LDS, to do the works of Abraham. Enter ye into my law, and ye shall be saved. But if ye enter not into my law, ye cannot receive the promise made unto Abraham. That's D&C 132, 30 through 33, you see. From the monuments we learn that these men's disciples made up regular schools, and these schools lasted for centuries, mind you. This is big stuff. And so once again, we're reminded of Abraham and Enoch and some of the prophets in the light of the new researches. Their communities, you see, resembled those of the desert sectaries. And this brings in the whole idea of the Dead Sea Scrolls, absolutely through time. The Essene societies can be traced to their origins to Egypt in a number of cases. At any rate, there was a school of Imhotep in operation at Memphis in ancient Egypt, and it was venerated right into the 19th century at nearby Saqqara. Wow, that is interesting, isn't it? This is where he had begun his career more than 4,500 years before. Significantly, his shrine in that place is a ruin called the Prison of Joseph. Now, Wildung asks this question. This kind of puzzled him, apparently, and he says, "We cannot describe the reason why the temple was referred to as the prison of the biblical Joseph. For a clue, we may consider Wildung's own observation that the worship of the two heroes began at their tombs, interestingly enough. And of course, the tombs are the objects of pilgrimage, and they became shrines and temples. But Muslims and Christians would not repair to the tomb of an unknown pagan, that is, Imhotep. If the age-old worship were to continue, and such folkways are virtually indestructible, it would have to be under different auspices. So, it was established practice to transfer the shrines of ancient gods and heroes to Christian and Muslim saints. And how do you do this? You simply change the name, of course. There was Joseph, a great favorite with humble Christians, Jews, and Muslims alike. Was not he too, like Imhotep and Amenhotep, the Grand Vizier of Egypt? Very well. The highest official in the land? Yes, indeed. Riding forth with Pharaoh to the wild cheers of the populace, whom he had saved from a 7-year famine, just as Imhotep had done? Absolutely. So call it the prison of Joseph. See, it's remarkable how the ancients think, isn't it? We moderns, we don't do it quite this way, but that doesn't mean the ancients didn't. Well, that's very interesting. Their culture is not our culture, and yet their ideologies can be used by ourselves with great effect. Oh boy, we need to do more of that. See, this is part of the value of reading the ancient literature. We have to remember something, folks. Egypt survived for millennia. America has been around not yet just 300 years, and we already have enough possession of weapons to destroy this world several times over. What's wrong with our ideologies? Yeah, you see, you got to check your assumptions, don't you? Well, to that great-grandfather Abraham, the humblest people of Egypt, and you got to remember too, these people weren't Christians and they weren't Muslims to the later period. They addressed their prayers on Coptic ostraka, but Joseph has no tomb in Egypt. He was buried in Canaan, according to Exodus 13:19, you see. Well, not to worry. He had something almost as good, if not better, the prison where he was entombed for years, and of course this became the main shrine. So this is really interesting. Now, Nibley does go on to say, on pages 106 and 107, that the greatest of the Greeks and their disciples studied in Egypt. And of course you have Solon, and you have Plato, and Strabo, as a tourist on the spot, describes the big barrack-like buildings at Heliopolis, and so on and so forth. And they discuss Aristotle's learning and all that. Plato uses expressions that are to be found word for word in the pyramid texts and the later Theban theological writings. You see, even the Greeks, what was the greatness of Greece. What was it that made Greece so great? Perhaps it was because they saw the magnificent splendor of Egypt. They understood how long Egypt had survived. I mean, we still have their ruins. We build our civilization on plastic. No one's even going to know we existed. There isn't going to be any archaeological remains of our civilization in another 1,000 years. We still have the Egyptian ruins. But the Greeks perhaps adapted this thinking, this type of way of life, the ideology that it is through a mutual cooperation and uplifting of our fellow man worldwide that causes us to all excel. It's like the Hopis, and Nibley noted this too about the Hopis. If one of us have corn, we all have corn. In a famine, the Hopis don't die out as a civilization. No, they cooperate in a community view. And the New Testament notes this too, When the early Christians first got together, they put all their goods in a common source, and they all had all things in common and equal. And this is mentioned also in 3rd Nephi, in the Book of Mormon as well. I mean, this is Zion. This is the idea of the Zion of Enoch, you see. The Zion of Melchizedek, according to the Joseph Smith translation of the Bible. So on and on it goes. Well, on page 107, the great attraction of Egypt was at all times the exciting combination of religious and scientific thinking, mantic and sophic, intuitive and intellectual, the ancient and the progressive. The solid and visible achievements of the ancient Egyptians bade the observer take their message seriously as it does today. Well, the Egyptians, Theophrastus observed, are on the one hand the most rationally minded of all the people, and yet they live in an ambience submerged in ancient and recondite religious lore. This tradition is deeply religious, and at the same time it is persistently intellectual. The perfect example, one would say, of the bicameral blend. The Egyptians were convinced, writes Durchain, that the universe was organized and must be sustained by an effort of thought, and that if men ever forgot their responsibility and gave up intense mental concentration, ritual actualized by words and gestures, their world would collapse. You see, it is an involvement with the universe, with each other, that mattered to the Egyptians. Now, there must have been something to that because we still have their ruins. Our buildings, Nibley noted this in some of his Book of Mormon talks that I have tape recorded in his honors classes in 1986. I don't know which tape, but probably 19 or 20 or whichever one. He noted that the engineers of today design the multi-$100 million buildings to be destroyed in 20 years. They build up these huge, magnificent skyscrapers for business, hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars, and they raise them to the ground in 20 years. No one's even going to know we were ever even here, as far as that goes. Fascinating, isn't it? Well, the most striking, he says this on page 108 now, the most striking feature of Egyptian language in all of its stages is its concrete realism. Herodotus describes the Egyptian doctors as ever striving for exact knowledge, actually cataloging and carefully marking off the years. Diodorus describes how they worked everything into a single system. What they did is, first they looked at the sky, of course. They discovered the motions of the stars and the laws of harmony in the cosmos, all of which are connected. So then they invent writing, this idea of writing, and their ritual services of the temples. They even first cultivated the olive, and all the basic knowledge of the Greeks come from them. It all goes back to the sacred Hermetic books. For Hermes, that is Thoth, as the scribe of Osiris, was privy to all of his knowledge and secrets. The most wise Egyptians, having measured the earth, tamed the waves of the sea, measured the Nile, calculated the distance